Ala Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese, and welcome to our fourth video, breaking down some of the differences between the first book in Professor Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring movie. So in the last video we talked about the Old Forest and Tom Bombadil and the Barrow Downs, and now I'm going to pick up the story with the hobbits arriving in Bree. And it's at this point in the story that the book and the movie kind of come together again. And for the most part, the movie is pretty faithful here. Although I'll start with just two little details that always kind of amuse me. Firstly, in every single adaptation I've seen of Bree since the Lord of the Rings movie, it's always dark and it's always raining. And obviously that's not the case in the book, and it's obviously not a big deal, and I guess it's really just a testament to how iconic the movies are. But there's actually a little moment in this chapter in the book where Merry decides to go out for a walk at night, and he looks up at the stars, and it's actually quite an important part of the story, so we can be confident that it's not constantly raining in Bree. Anyway, the second fun little detail here is just how horrified the hobbits are at the sight of 2- and 3-story buildings. Like, especially Sam, he is so unnerved by the idea that buildings would have staircases and multiple floors. It's so alien from what he's familiar with a hobbit hole, and it just reminds us that although we're still pretty early on in the quest, we are not in the Shire anymore. This is the land of the big folk. And the first one of the big folk that the hobbits encounter is this guy, the gatekeeper, who Tolkien tells us is named Harry Goatleaf. Now, Harry Goatleaf is far from a vital character, but in the movie it's implied he is killed, right, when the Nazgûl attack Bree. But in the book he survives, and he's actually a bit of a shadier dude. You see, we learn a little later in the book that this Harry Goatleaf is under the power of the Nazgûl, and he seems to be working for them, or at least Frodo suspects he might be doing evil work on their behalf. In fact, actually, we learn in Return of the King that after the hobbits leave Bree, this guy teams up with another brigand called Bill Ferny, and together they murder 5 Breelanders. Then it's implied they go off and join Saruman's army of ruffians. So in the books, this Harry Goatleaf fella is not a nice guy. But he doesn't stop our heroes, and upon, Tom Bombadil's recommendation, the hobbits head to a 3-story inn called the Prancing Pony, and it's here that they meet Balam and Butterbur. Now, if you saw the second video in this little series, then you'll know this is not the first time Old Barlaman's shown up in the story. Remember when I said Gandalf came to Bree before heading to Orthanc to get imprisoned by Saruman? Well, he left a letter, didn't he? That he told Butterbur to deliver to Frodo in the Shire. But this never happened. Butterbur forgot. And so Gandalf's letter is still here in the Prancing Pony when Frodo arrives. Now, as I say, this part in the movie is all pretty faithful to the book. We see the Prancing Pony and the colourful cast of characters that mingle in the common room, and of course we get a quick glimpse of Strider. And we get a very quick glimpse of Bill Ferny, who in the movie doesn't really do anything, but in the book serves as a bit of a minor antagonist. And he becomes especially important during Frodo's blunder with the ring, although this does go a little differently in the book. So in both versions we do see the whole thing is kind of Pippin's fault. In the movie he's just openly talking about Baggins, but in the book he's talking about Bilbo's disappearing act on his 11th birthday when Pippin was only 11 years old. And instead of tripping and falling backwards like in the movie, Frodo actually tries to shut Pippin up by creating an even bigger distraction. So Frodo actually jumps up onto one of the tables and he begins singing a Hobbit song. And as was probably pretty common with inns, everyone in the common room just begins to join in and sing along, and during one particularly enthusiastic leap up into the air, Frodo falls off the table and the ring slips onto his finger while his hand is in his pocket. Now, this event is witnessed by a few shady characters, including Bill Ferny and Harry Goatleaf. And they actually both leave the inn and report this information to the Nazgûl. And that is actually how the Nazgûl, how the Ringwraiths are able to find the Prancing Pony in the book. So yeah, like I said, Bill Ferny and Harry Goatleaf are not good guys. But anyway, the movie is pretty faithful with the introduction of Strider and his chastising of Frodo. But in the movie, the hobbits seem to trust him fairly quickly, whereas in the book, they see him as just another potentially dangerous stranger. And this is actually where Gandalf's letter comes back into play. Because it's only now that Barlaman remembers to deliver it. And so Frodo reads for the first time all this information he was supposed to have before leaving. And one of the things included in the letter is a passage about Gandalf's friend, who is known amongst the wilds as Strider, but his true name is Aragorn. And so it's this letter, along with the fact that Strider divulges the name Aragorn himself, that moves Frodo to eventually trust him. Now, just before I move on, Gandalf actually ends this letter with a really beautiful and really iconic little poem about Aragorn that I'm sure you've all heard before because it is included in the movies, although not at this point. But I'll read it for you now because it really gives us a bit of a hint as to just how special Aragorn truly is. So the poem goes: "All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadow shall spring. Renewed shall be the blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king." So, this letter is taken as kind of proof that both Strider and Frodo are who they say they are, and they both have Gandalf vouching for them. And so eventually the hobbits begin to trust Strider. Well, I mean, for the most part. Good old Sam, he remains healthily skeptical, but in time even he begins to recognize that this ranger probably is indeed a friend. But, unlike this scene in the movie, not all of the hobbits are present here. Because remember I said earlier that Merry goes out for a walk? Well, that's what he does. But honestly, I gotta say, poor Merry doesn't have a particularly good time of it out on this walk. You see, as Merry is out wandering in the dark, he comes across a black rider. And we don't really know what happens to him, but when a local hobbit finds him, he sees that Merry has been struck down by the black breath of the Nazgûl. Now, the black breath isn't the most clearly defined weapon of the Nazgûl, but it seems to be that they literally have a poisonous breath that weakens and overpowers all who are exposed to it. And this isn't actually the last time we see the weapon used. See, in Return of the King, both Éowyn and Faramir are overcome by the Witch King's black breath, and Merry gets black-breathed again. In the Battle of Pelennor Fields, the poor guy is the only person we know of who gets black-breathed twice. Poor dude. But anyway, it's when Merry is brought back to the Prancing Pony that Aragorn realizes the Nazgûl must be in Bree already. And so he organizes for the hobbits to swap their rooms without telling anyone. Now, this scene in the movie where the Ringwraiths attack is one of the most iconic and terrifying moments, I think, in the whole trilogy. But in the book, it's not actually clear whether the Nazgûl attack the inn themselves, or whether they simply order Bill Ferny and his cronies to ransack the hobbits' rooms and presumably murder them for the One Ring. But of course, that's not what happens, thanks to Aragorn's intervention. And when he wakes the hobbits up the next morning, they find their rooms plundered and their ponies missing. So this is where we meet Bill the pony, who does actually feature in the movie. But in the book, we're told that he was originally owned by none other than Bill Ferny, who starved him and mistreated him and then sold him to Sam for 3 times more than his original value. Which is pretty cheeky, considering that Bill Ferny is probably the dude who got rid of the Hobbit's ponies in the first place. Although, there is a lovely little detail here, because just before the Hobbits leave Bree, Samwise Gamgee takes up an apple, and he hurls it at Bill Ferny's head. Which I find really hilarious, especially because Sam later deeply regrets this action, as it was a waste of a perfectly good apple. Now, Bill Ferny isn't exactly Shelob, but he does have the distinction of being the very first villain ever to be vanquished by Sam Gamgee, even if it is just with an apple. But anyway, moving on with the story, the movie is very faithful to the book through this point, and Aragorn does indeed lead the hobbits through the Midgewater marshes, over the Weather Hills, until they eventually come within sight of Weathertop. Now, we all know what happens here, but before I go on with the story, I do want to quickly jump back to Gandalf and catch you up on what he's been doing since we last saw him, back in the second episode, where he was riding full speed on Shadowfax all the way from Rohan up to the Shire. So, at around the same time the hobbits were being rescued from the Barrow Downs, Gandalf finally arrived at the southern borders of the Shire. And the next day, he went to visit an old familiar face, Gaffer Gamgee, aka Sam's dad. And the Gaffer tells Gandalf that Frodo has moved to Crick Hollow. So without wasting any time, Gandalf sets off, and that evening he arrives at the door of good old Fatty Bolger, who explains that Frodo has already left. Now this is good news, so Gandalf rides straight to Bree, and he actually arrives at the Prancing Pony only hours after Frodo and everyone else had left. Now, as you can probably imagine, Gandalf was not happy at Barlam and Butterbur for forgetting the letter, and he actually threatens to burn him up. But he does very quickly get over it when he hears that the hobbits are alive and safe with Aragorn, which really was the best case scenario Gandalf could have hoped for. In fact, Gandalf is in such a good mood that we're told he even blesses Barlaman's beer for 7 years before leaving. So that's nice. But anyway, Gandalf now knows that Aragorn and the hobbits are headed to Rivendell, and he knows it's a long way through wild country, so he decides that his best chance of finding them is to find high ground. And one of the highest points in this part of the world is the old watchtower of Amon Sul, which we know better as Weathertop. Now, none of this is included in the chapter, and neither Frodo nor anyone else learns of this until much later, when Gandalf fills them all in the Council of Elrond, but there is a really awesome moment in the book where Aragorn and the hobbits are all camped beneath Weathertop. And Frodo looks up at the hill and he sees a great battle of light and flame raging high above him. Now, he doesn't know what these are, and the reader doesn't know what these are. But Tolkien does eventually tell us that these lights and fires are cast by Gandalf. You see, Gandalf beat the hobbits to Weathertop, and so his plan was just to wait for them there. But in the night, he is attacked by the Nazgûl, who have also beaten the hobbits to Weathertop. And so that's what these lights and flames are. They are this epic battle between Gandalf and all 9 Nazgûl. But Frodo only sees this from afar. So it'll come as no surprise that Gandalf wins this fight, and he is successfully able to drive the Nazgûl away. But before Gandalf departs, he carves a rune of the letter G into a rock for Aragorn and the hobbits to find. Now, this does leave Gandalf at a bit of a loose end. He knows Aragorn and the hobbits are out there, but he also knows the Nazgûl are out there, and I think he worries that if he tries to find his friends, he could very well end up leading the Nazgûl to them. So instead, Gandalf rides full speed towards Rivendell in the hopes that the Nazgûl will follow him and thus leave Aragorn and the hobbits alone. And this kind of works, or at least to an extent. You see, 4 of the Nazgûl do break away from the other 5, and they pursue Gandalf and Shadowfax all the way east to the last bridge, where they are eventually driven off by, well, another character that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. But this is actually the reason for that line in the movie that Arwen says,
"There are 5 wraiths behind you. Where the other 4 are, I do not know."
Well, Arwen, the other 4 wraiths are off hunting Gandalf. So that is the tale of the Grey Wizard. But I guess we ought to return to Aragorn and the hobbits, because it is here that we have one of the most iconic and chilling moments of the whole book. And the movie does a really good job at making the attack on Weathertop truly terrifying, and for the most part it is pretty faithful to the book. I mean, it doesn't quite happen on the summit of Weathertop, and in the book there are only 3 Nazgûl who approach the hobbits, and of them 2 hold back, and it is only one, only the Lord of the Nazgûl, who springs forward and stabs Frodo with his Morgul blade. And right here we have another great example of the movies making Frodo so much more pathetic than he is in the book. Like, in this scene in the film, Frodo is, let's not beat around the bush, he is utterly useless. He drops his sword and he falls over and he gets stabbed like a total loser. But in the book, when Frodo puts on the ring and he sees the wraiths for what they truly are, he draws his sword, his barrow blade, and he attacks the Lord of the Nazgûl, and he calls out the name Elbereth Githorniel, which is of course the name of Varda, the goddess of light. Check out my First Age videos if you haven't already. And Frodo strikes at the feet of the Witch King. Now, this is kind of the reason that he gets stabbed, so fair enough, Frodo might not be like super intelligent, but he is so much more heroic and so much more courageous than he is ever portrayed in the movie. So bear that in mind next time you hear someone complaining about how lame Frodo is. But anyway, that's my little rant over for now, I guess, because straight after this in the movie, we see Aragorn jump out and he has this badass hero moment where he fights off the Nazgûl and saves the day. And this kind of happens in the book, but Aragorn doesn't sword fight with the Nazgûl in quite the same way, and this fight actually kind of misrepresents what the Nazgûl are all about. You see, their main weapon is fear, not steel. They're not warriors like the Uruk-hai, they are wraiths. They're mortal men, no longer alive but unable to die. And so the real danger of the Nazgûl is not in their fighting, it is in their ability to destroy the will and the morale and the spirit of their enemies. Anyway, this next part is a bit different in the movie too, because although Frodo is badly injured by the shard of Morgul blade in his shoulder, he's not quite on death's door just yet. Which is a good thing, because Frodo and the gang still have an incredibly long way to go. Like, Weathertop is only halfway between Bree and the last bridge, which is, in and of itself, still 100 miles from Rivendell. And so, Frodo has no choice but to walk for 12 days after being stabbed. But when they do finally arrive at the last bridge, Aragorn finds on the ground a green elf stone, which he takes as a sign that the bridge is safe and the Nazgûl have been driven off. Now, this stone was left by that same mysterious character I mentioned a few minutes ago when I was talking about Gandalf, and he is going to be very important very soon. So, 4 days after crossing the last bridge is when the hobbits and Aragorn stumble across Bilbo's stone trolls. And this nice little moment is referenced in the movie too. But it is that evening that Aragorn and the hobbits once again hear the sound of a rider approaching their camp, and of course, they assume the worst. But this rider is no Nazgûl. Instead, he is an elf. Now, I don't believe there's a single one of you watching who doesn't know that in the book, this elf is not Arwen. But I have to say, perhaps controversially, that I actually really like this change to Arwen. And I know some people don't like it because that's not what Arwen does in the book. But, I mean, to be fair, what does Arwen do in the book? The answer is not a great deal. Like, if you tally up all the scenes that Arwen is in throughout all 6 books, it's like 4 pages. In fact, most of what we know about her comes from the appendices, not even the story itself. So if you're going to have Arwen in a movie, you're gonna have to invent something for her to do. And I think getting Frodo to Rivendell is actually a great addition to her character. But I feel like the main reason that a lot of people get upset about this change is because it cuts out a fan favorite character. And that is, of course, the one and only Elven Lord Glorfindel. Now, I'm not going to talk about Glorfindel's history in this video because Glorfindel is technically an elf of the First Age, and I got plans to talk about him in due time. But what you need to know in this video is that Glorfindel has mad powers. Like, they go beyond anything that pretty much any other elf is capable of. And the reason for that is Glorfindel isn't just any other elf. He's basically Elf Jesus. Okay, so that might be a bit of a stretch because Tolkien was a devout Catholic and he explicitly said that none of his writing should be taken as like an allegory or anything like that. But Glorfindel is almost unique in the sense that he died during the First Age. He was killed, but he was resurrected by the gods and sent back to Middle-earth with way more divine power than he ever had before. Now, the only other character in the entire Legendarium who could possibly share this claim to fame is, of course, Gandalf the White. So yeah, Glorfindel is a big deal. But anyway, it's not like Elf Jesus just happens to stumble across Aragorn and the hobbits. No, instead, he's been riding around the wilds on his horse Asphalloth for 9 days. And in that time, he's been busy driving off the Nazgûl from the last bridge and dropping that elf stone for Aragorn to find. You see, Glorfindel has been sent out into the wilds by Lord Elrond, and he's been sent out to do just one thing. He needs to ensure that the ring and its bearer safely make it to Rivendell. Now, this doesn't sound complicated, but if he should fail, and the Nazgûl should take the ring and Sauron should reclaim it, then all would fall to ruin. So, for the first 2 days, Glorfindel just acts as a guide for Aragorn and the hobbits, leading them on a safe road. And unlike in the movie, Frodo doesn't just ride ahead at this point. No, he stays with the group. But when our heroes draw near to their destination and there are only 8 miles left on their journey, the Nazgûl, now reunited to their full number of 9, finally catch up with the ring. And things do not look good. Frodo is rapidly turning into a wraith, and neither Aragorn nor Glorfindel have the power to save him. But what Glorfindel does have is an insanely swift horse. And so he puts Frodo up on Asphalloth and he tells him to ride all the way to the fords of Bruinen, which marks the borders of Rivendell. So I know in the movie it's Arwen who does all the riding while Frodo's pretty much just passed out, but this scene marks another incredibly missed opportunity. Because in the book, at this moment, Frodo demonstrates an unparalleled degree of badassery. You see, he and Asphalloth alone outrun the Nazgûl. And when Frodo is finally borne across the river, he turns around and draws his sword and he looks upon the Nine. And because he's on the brink of becoming a Wraith himself, Frodo sees them for what they truly are. And he defies them. And I'm going to read Tolkien's exact words here because they're awesome. So, with a great effort, Frodo sat upright and brandished his sword. "Go back," he cried, "go back to the land of Mordor and follow me no more." "Go back," he whispered. "By Elbereth and Luthien the Fair," said Frodo with a last effort, lifting up his sword, "you shall have neither the ring nor me." So, I just want everyone to be super aware of this moment. Because Frodo gets a lot of hate in the movies, and I've heard it said that he only exists to make Sam look cooler. But in this moment, as he's dying, Frodo lifts up his sword and basically tells the Nazgûl, "You can go to hell." And with that, Tolkien ends the first book in The Lord of the Rings. But before I finish, there's one more thing I want to talk about. Because in the movie, it's kind of implied that Arwen is the one who goads the Nazgûl into the river and then summons the flood of horses to wash them away. But that's not what Tolkien tells us. You see, even after Frodo defies the Nazgûl, they remain reluctant to enter the water. I reckon they must know that in this part of the world, Elrond is the top dog and not their master Sauron. So, they fear to cross the Bruinen. But, while the Nazgûl hesitate, Frodo's friends arrive on the other side of the river, and they drive the Nazgûl into the water with fire. Now, you might be thinking, how does Sam, Merry and Pippin drive 9 Nazgûl into the water? And to be fair, it's probably Glorfindel who does most of the work here. Because, just as Frodo can now see the Nazgûl for what they truly are, he can also see Glorfindel in his true form. And what he sees is this intense light emanating from a figure in white. And this light of Glorfindel is enough to force the Nazgûl into the river, where, as we know, they are swept away by a trifecta of awesome, the power of Elrond, Gandalf and Glorfindel all combine to summon this great flood of horses that drown the Nazgûl in the roaring river and wash them away. And as the Ringwraiths are engulfed, so too is Frodo, and he hears and sees no more. And dear friends, that is the end of Book 1, The Ring Sets Out. Now, there will certainly be new Tolkien videos coming soon, although these videos take quite a long time to make, and I need time to make them, so bear with me. Unless, of course, you're watching these in the future, in which case, no worries then, just click the next video. But as always, dear friends, until next time, much love, stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.